The human eye can see around 10 million colors. But fortunately, we don't need to learn all of them. What we need to know is that color can be broken down into three properties, which are hue, saturation, and luminosity. And before we can do any color correction, we must first understand these three properties, as otherwise, we'd be shooting in the dark and wasting time. Grasping how HSL or hue, saturation and luminosity work, will help us apply color correction effectively and efficiently. Let's start by looking at the three properties. The first property of color is the hue. Hue is the actual color or a shade of a color. In fact, when we think of colors, we are actually thinking of hues. The second property of color is saturation. Saturation is basically the intensity or vividness of a hue. The intensity of a hue is decreased the more gray it has. So a very saturated color has little or no gray in it, while a very dull desaturated color has a lot of gray in it. For example, let's take this bright red color here, which is highly saturated. If we start adding gray to it, it will desaturate, and the more we add, the more it desaturates until it finally becomes completely gray. Our last property of color is luminosity. If we take a color photo and remove all color by converting it to black and white, what we're left with is the luminosity information of the image. Therefore, luminosity is how bright or dark a hue is. If we add white to a color, we increase its luminosity, and if we add black, we decrease the luminosity. When correcting the luminosity of an asset, we need to think about the dynamic range of our photos. So what is dynamic range in photography? Dynamic range is the luminance difference between the darkest point and the brightest point in a photo, also known as contrast ratio. To understand this better, I have prepared two examples for comparison. I want us to focus on luminosity, so I'm using black and white photos. Let's take a look at the first photo of these mountains, which was shot on a brighter day. We can see very dark areas, as well as very bright areas and of course all the shades in between. If we look at the second photo, which was shot on a cloudier day, we can also see very dark areas, however the brighter parts are not as bright as the first image. The photo shot on a brighter day has a greater dynamic range than the one shot on a cloudier day. In other words, there is much more contrast between the darkest points and the brightest points. This is important in photo manipulation. Because each source image would have been shot differently, each image would have a different dynamic range. Therefore, during the color correction stage, we need to match the dynamic ranges of all our images. However, the dynamic range is not about the darkest and brightest points only. You can have two photos with the same dynamic range between the shadows and the highlights and still look different. This is because the dynamic range has three parts. These are shadows, which are the darkest points, midtones, and highlights, which are the brightest points. The midtones play a very important role in luminosity, so let's understand how they work. Midtones are neither shadows nor highlights but rather a middle value of luminance in between. The midtones can be closer to the shadows, making the range of the shadows narrower and the range of highlights wider. This means that the image would have more bright areas than dark areas. A good example of this is the background in our artwork. In this photo, we can see more light areas than dark areas. That's because the dynamic range has a wider range between the midtones and the highlights. On the flip side, we might have images where the range is larger between the midtones and the shadows. An example of this is our photo of the woman. We can see that the image has more dark areas than light areas. So, when matching the dynamic range of photos, we need to keep in mind three things: the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. If we match these three, our images will look like they belong together from a luminosity point of view. And those were the three properties of color. There are different tools and techniques for adjusting these to color correct our images. There are even automation tools that can do this. However, I like to keep things simple, and in the next lesson, I will show you the tools that I use, which are very effective and easy to use. When doing color correction, we should have a key reference image, and match the HSL of the other images in the artwork to it. I always try to use the main asset or the background in my artwork as a reference, and color correct all other objects to match. Okay, let's do a quick recap of this lesson. Hue is the color itself. Saturation is the intensity or vividness of a hue. When compositing, we cannot mix a highly saturated photo with a desaturated one. All photos need to have the same amount of saturation. Luminosity is how bright or dark a hue is. To color correct our images correctly in terms of luminosity, we need to look into the dynamic range of each photo and keep in mind the shadows, midtones, and highlights.